This is the Precious Hope story. On February 28, 1983, two men rummaged through the basement of a vacant apartment building at 5635 Clemens Avenue in St. Louis West End Cabanne neighborhood. They discovered the headless body of a little African American girl in the apartment's basement. They noticed her after lighting a cigarette which illuminated the dank cellar. She was found lying on her stomach. She wore only a yellow long-sleeved V-neck sweater and two coats of red crimson nail polish on her fingers. Her head had been severed cleanly, possibly by a cleaver. Only the killer or killers and God know what torture and horrific details surrounded her young life and death. Her identity still remains a mystery. Now, 36 years later, it remains the most notorious cold case in the history of the St. Louis Police Department, and it still haunts homicide detectives. She was referred to as Jane Doe for many years, and has now been nicknamed Precious Hope, with the headstone engraved as such. Sadly, we know nothing about her, except her approximate age, weight, height, skin color, and the possible region she was living in prior to her death. Who was this innocent little girl? Why hasn't someone reported a missing girl? Her school? A neighbor? A family member? A friend? Someone? A little girl just disappears and no one notices or reports her missing? That day, the looters said that they ventured into the basement of the building in search of a metal pipe that they could use to fix down their broken down jalopy, but many know this was also a neighborhood full of drug addicts that would rummage through buildings in search of copper wire to sell. Some just wanted a place to shoot drugs, but whatever their purpose was that day, it was in no way connected to her death. Initially, she was believed to have been a prostitute until police moved her body and discovered she didn't have developed breasts, indicating she hadn't gone through puberty yet. Further examination was conducted within the next week, and it was estimated that she was between 8 and 11 when she was murdered. She was believed to have been killed by strangulation. She was raped and decapitated, and the brutality of this crime led to national attention back in 1983. Her head has never been located, preventing dental examination and the possibility of a traditional facial reconstruction. It was concluded by law enforcement that she was not killed at that location where she was discovered, as no traces of blood were found by her body. This led law enforcement to believe that blood had been drained from her body elsewhere. Her stomach was also empty at the time of her death. The Missouri Botanical Garden performed mold tests on her body, which determined she had been killed within 5 days of her discovery. She had been bound at the wrists with red nylon cord. Her fingerprints, footprints, and DNA information had been collected, and there were no distinct marks or deformities on her body. She was approximately 4 feet 10 inches tall when she was alive. 10 months later, after her discovery with no new leads for investigators, she was buried at Washington Park Cemetery, directly across from Lambert Airport in Berkeley, Missouri, St. Louis, on December 2nd, 1983. Her sweater had previously been sent by law enforcement to a psychic in Florida who wanted to touch it to receive a psychic impression. However, the sweater was never returned and presumed to have been lost in the mail. 4 missing girls had been ruled out as the victim. She was also presumed to have been a victim of Vernon Brown, who had murdered other young girls in a similar manner. However, they could not tie Brown to the murder, and he was executed in 2005 and did not confess to murdering Precious Hope, despite efforts made by investigators. Authorities decided to exhume her body in 2013 in order to gather more forensic information about her. The remains had been misplaced, along with many other bodies in the Washington Park Cemetery, due to the negligence of cemetery records, and were not found until mid-June 17, 2013. Her remains were located by using camera calibration techniques, and they were able to find exactly and determine precisely where her casket was due to the photograph that was taken the day of the burial. Isotope tests on samples of her bones were undertaken to determine the area where she would have most likely lived based on the mineral content in her body. According to an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the test results concluded that she was likely to have lived her entire life in one of the 10 southeastern states: Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, or North or South Carolina. However, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's catalog entered an alternate list, and it was the Midwestern Mid-Atlantic states, such as Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, or West Virginia. Now, on that day, police officers searched a 16-block area for the little girl's head. Detectives returned to headquarters to check the missing persons reports. Surely, they thought, the girl's parents or relatives, someone, would call to report her missing. With any luck, they'd establish her identity that night and draw up a list of suspects. A national all-points bulletin yielded nothing. Soon they began checking school attendance records, looking for students no longer on the rolls. Only the St. Louis Public School District kept computerized attendance records at that time, but even those lists gave no indication as to where a student went after leaving school. Finally, some 7 months after the murder, the detectives accounted for every 8 to 11-year-old black female enrolled in St. Louis City School District and the neighboring districts of University City, Wellston, Ferguson, Florissant, and Normandy. Who was she? For the most part, it was just guesswork, with detectives calling as many as half a dozen school districts before locating a child. For each child eliminated, hundreds more remained to be checked. So mind-numbingly frustrated was the task that the detectives actually had to be hospitalized for migraines. Wayne Bender was hospitalized for migraines as well. Her body went unclaimed on a slab in the city morgue for more than a week before she was given the name Jane Doe. For 9 months she lay frozen. Finally, on a glum rainy day in December 1983, she was buried in a pauper's grave in a historic black graveyard. At the funeral, there were only a few homicide detectives, the chief medical examiner, and half a dozen newspaper reporters. 4 muddy gravediggers served as the pallbearers. As he was leaving, Detective Herb Riley told a reporter, "I've been involved with her since the day she was found, and I'll be damned if I'm going to stop looking for her killer." The day of the grisly discovery, February 28th, still casts a pall over the homicide department. For years, Detective Joe Burgon commemorated that day by sending out teletype bulletins to police departments in all 50 states, but no one ever responded. After a dozen years, he was told that the mass dispatches were too costly to continue. Today, homicide detectives observe the occasion in hushed tones of remorse. In his mind, Joe Burgon could still see the building where they found her. It's a 3-story high brick with Latin words Domi, D-O-M-I, inscribed in the stone above the doorway. Traces of blood streaked the cellar walls where the killer dragged her body into the darkness. And there was no smell of death that day because the coolness of the basement preserved her body. Mary Case, the city's medical examiner at the time of the murder, says the case affected Joe Burgon more than any detective. During those months, the little girl lay in the morgue. Those two were in constant contact, investigating any leads that might reveal her identity. After retiring in 1986, Detective Riley brought home all his boxes of his notes and kept in regular contact with Joe Burgon and any other detectives working the case. His son Jeff Riley said, "He was constantly talking about the case. I remember visiting him at the hospital and asking him if he was happy with his life and what he'd done. He was on his deathbed. He replied that he was, but he said he wished he could have solved the Jane Doe case. He said when he died he would finally know who did it. He believed the afterlife could reveal all of life's mysteries." Desperate for something, anything, police tracked down a score of false leads over the years, some more preposterous than others. For example, The time, just months after the murder, that a frantic woman appeared at the police headquarters claiming to have just met the killer. She said he lived just a few blocks from the shuttered building. The woman said the man invited her into his apartment and showed her a human skull and a machete. Minutes later, Bergen, Riley, and Atkins arrived at the apartment with a search warrant and a sledgehammer. They busted the door down and recovered the skull and the knife. The machete was a novelty piece you could bend a million ways. It could never cut someone's head off, recalls Bergon. He got the skull from a high school teacher in California. It was all verified. He just wasn't the guy. Then there was the Charlotte police officer who got a skull from a man he had questioned at a storage shed on St. Charles Rock Road, according to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Danny Davis of Pagedale told the cop he bought the skull for $35 in the late 1970s at a souvenir gift shop near Northwest Plaza. That's a shopping mall in North County, St. Louis. Davis said he was told that the skull was that of a young Indian woman who had been killed by a tomahawk. A forensic anthropologist determined that it was much too old to have been Jane Doe's skull. Other leads had been less conventional. Grasping for clues, Bergon once sat in a seance in a Maplewood home. Under dim candlelight, the detective passed around photocopied fingerprints of Jane Doe to a table full of psychics. As the clairvoyants channeled the spirits, Bergon sat in the corner and observed. The psychics put their hands on the fingerprints and would shoot straight up in their chairs, just like they got a jolt or something, he remembers. At the end of the meeting, they told me to call the Coast Guard. They said the head is in a boat off the Gulf of Mexico. The seance wouldn't be the last time the homicide detectives looked into the paranormal for help. In 1994, Bergon and Atkins agreed to appear on Sightings, a nationally syndicated television show on the occult and supernatural. Connected by phone, the homicide detective sat in St. Louis with notepads at the ready, while a psyche in Florida entered the mind of Jane Doe. Producers filled in the backdrop with Hitchcockian-themed music and shadowy slow-motion footage of children at play. The final product was vague enough to seem eerily real, but it only harmed the investigation. Prior to the show's taping, detectives mailed the psychics the bloodied sweater and the nylon rope used to bind Jane Doe's hands, and they never got them back. This was the evidence that I was speaking about that was lost in the mail. It's terrible. Perhaps the most far-fetched story surrounding the case came back in 2002 when Sharon Nolte called detectives. A Kansas City insurance investigator, she was convinced that Jane Doe was a Chippewa Indian named Shannon Johnson. Nolte said that she knew the killer, a drifter living in South Texas. She worked the case independently for 7 years before contacting the police. Her investigation taking her to an Indian reservation in Minnesota where she collected sample DNA from a woman she believed to be related to Jane Doe. She says she even visited the killer, inviting herself into his home and collecting his DNA evidence in the bathroom. All the tests came back negative, but Nolte remained consistent that she was right. She insisted that. Detectives Tom Carroll and Jeff Stone were the new detectives on the case years later, and they even flew down to Texas to interview Tommy Lynn Sells, a death row inmate, and he was on death row for the brutal murder of a 13-year-old girl. Sells claims to have committed dozens of murders across the country, including 5 in Missouri, but the interview was inconclusive, and Carroll doubts Sells' involvement. He said, "I'll claim anything. Whatever you put in front of him, he'll say he did it. He says it's him." But, you don't want to play anybody cheap, says Bergon. In a case as tough as this one, you want to listen to what somebody has to say. What else do you have to lose? Buried within the website of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children lies a page devoted to Jane Doe. Of the roughly 1,400 children profiled, she's the only child without a mugshot or an artist's rendering. In its place appears the bloodied yellow sweater found on her body, along with the information about skin color, weight, and age. Who was this innocent little girl? Was she held without anyone knowing that she existed for her entire life? Or was she the child of a victim, of an abuser, too afraid to come forward and report her death? What was her name? What was she like? What did she like to do? Was she happy? Was she quiet? Was she shy? Did she like to draw or ride a bike? What's her favorite color? What did she dream of growing up to be? Life failed her. Adults failed her. Somewhere, someone knows who she is. She was someone's child, grandchild, niece, cousin, schoolmate, friend, and neighbor. May she rest in peace, and her killer and those who contributed to her death burn in hell for eternity. For the rest of us, she's our little girl, and she will forever remain precious hope. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe.